Welcome back, everybody. We are halfway through the last season of the best show on television, and I think it's time for just a little bit more analysis. I don't say Better Call Saul is the best show to exaggerate. If anyone ever asks me my favorite show, I say Better Call Saul. And I'll tell you the next thing I say, since it always makes people so interested or upset, probably is the better word for it. I've never seen Breaking Bad. Not one episode. This is the secret I hinted at in the previous video. Let me know if you think I should check it out. I heard it was pretty good. And let me know if you could tell that I hadn't seen it. Maybe I'll watch it one day, but I actually can't remember the last drama I watched besides this one, Better Call Saul. I could name 20 comedy shows I've watched in the last few years, but I don't watch many dramas. I've never seen The Wire or House or Dexter or Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead or Lost or The Sopranos or Succession or many others. And I'm sure these are all great, but they just don't draw me in. I don't have room in my life for a lot of drama. Maybe I'm uncultured swine, you know? Or just a creature of habit. But I will say that as much as there may be some things in Better Call Saul that I miss, having not seen Breaking Bad, I feel like it gives me a pretty unique relationship to the show, and I can experience all the characters fresh with no previous context for Jimmy, Mike, Fring, and the rest of them. I love everything about Better Call Saul. The acting is incredible across the board. The relationships are believable, the cinematography is beautiful, the dialogue is interesting and funny, and the original soundtrack is all over the place in the best way. I talked in part 1 about the show's slow pacing too, which is amazing, and which makes it deeply realistic. The slowness is boring to some people, but I love boring stuff, as you can probably tell from some of my longer videos. Subscribe if you like boring stuff too. I even love the show's intro, the way it's short and sounds like it gets cut off at the end. That abruptness is representative of the harsh way this show tries to be as honest as possible with the audience. It's like, hey, we're not going to give you a long cheesy intro with a, slow fade out, and we're also not going to lie to you about characters and motivation and people. I feel like I unburdened myself of so many thoughts that I'm now able to delve into the weird and even deeper ways this show made me reflect. Let me start with what I think is maybe the most important line in the whole series, and it may surprise you who is delivering it. In season 2, Mike spends time with his granddaughter Kaylee, and she helps him with a home project. Part of what she helps him with involves her knowledge of fractions, and we see them have this exchange.
I gotta tell you, you are much smarter than I was when I was your age.
Maybe you needed better teachers.
That could be.
Kaylee is a really interesting character because she's the most innocent one in the show, along with her mom, Mike's daughter-in-law Stacy. But Kaylee's even more innocent, of course, because she's a kid. In a way, she's like a peaceful little star that Mike's jagged meteor of a life is rotating around for the first few seasons. She's his happy place away from the corrupted world he can't help but be involved with. He lost his son to that corruption, and as we talked about in part 2, he uprooted his whole life from Pennsylvania to New Mexico after avenging his son's death. When we meet Mike, his life is in limbo as he's laying low on the lam from the police force he was on for decades. He's working as a parking lot attendant, which really says a lot about where he's at, I think, as there's something incredibly stagnant about that line of work. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm a therapist, so I literally sit all day, but see, my clients are sitting too. Being a parking lot attendant means sitting still while everyone around Mike drives. He sits in a box. He goes home and sits alone in the dark, watching shows seemingly from the 1950s from his childhood. When Kaylee says,
"Maybe you needed better teachers,"
Mike immediately understands her wisdom. His granddaughter is pointing out to him the nurture side of the nature versus nurture relationship, and of course she's right. Our lives could be very different depending on the role models and social influences we have. I say that Kaylee's line is the most important of the show because I think it sums up the show's central conflict: nature versus nurture. Take our main character Jimmy, for instance. The show makes us ask what his true nature really is. Is Jimmy selfish, irresponsible, and thrill-seeking? speaking, by nature? He's been scamming people for decades, for sure. But from the influence of Chuck, and even more so Kim, he becomes a lawyer and he does some valuable work. We see his integrity in situations like when he roots through a dumpster for evidence to help defend vulnerable residents of an unethical elder care home. But his influences shift over time, of course, and that causes some issues. We know Chuck could have been a lot more supportive, and Kim's moral compass explodes in the 4th, 5th, and 6th seasons, so Jimmy/Saul ends up not really knowing who he is, and neither do we. Is he scamming people for better reasons than he used to? Has he learned to care about others? This series is brutally honest and doesn't try to paint a fairy tale of Jimmy's life improving, but it's also honest, on the other hand, about the ever-possible potential for change. Even if it's just in a facial expression Jimmy makes, we see him experiencing some sense of the consequences of his actions, and we get the sense that he could change if he felt like fighting his natural impulses to take advantage of people. But wait, what if I have that backwards about what his nature is? What if Jimmy is naturally kind and compassionate, and it's the nurture side of things that influenced him to scam and manipulate people for many years? Could that be? For a case study in how this show makes us struggle with the nature-nurture question, let's look at this cold open flashback from the 2nd season when we see young Jimmy at his parents' store. A guy comes in and emotionally manipulates Jimmy's dad for some money, but when Jimmy tells his dad the guy is conning him, his dad doesn't believe him and gives the guy $10, which would be about $75 today. As his dad steps away momentarily, Jimmy gives the guy some solid silent treatment, clearly knowing he's scamming his dad, and the guy says to him,
"There are wolves and sheep in this world, kid. Wolves and sheep. Figure out which one you're gonna be."
It's an interesting moment, and Jimmy seems to take it to heart. We see him then steal from the register, maybe for the first time. He doesn't seem happy about it, but he accepts at that young and vulnerable age the stranger's description of the world being governed by this natural hierarchy. Obviously, we've all heard this kind of philosophy before. It's pretty much the same as people saying might is right. Let me ask you this, though. Isn't it interesting that the people who say there are only wolves and sheep in this world are always the quote-unquote wolves? Like, you never hear the supposed sheep having this philosophy. Interesting. It's almost as if this type of antisocial moral system is a self-serving rationalization, a means to an end of a person getting to do what they want and benefit themselves. It's interesting that this nurture type of influence on Jimmy takes the form of this guy making this claim about the nature of people. But it makes sense. Our view of our nature will always be somewhat shaped by our nurture in response to our environment. It's not clear to me whether little Jimmy takes this guy's portrayal of the world as the whole truth, or whether it just feels more true to him than the overly charitable way his dad sees the world. But as this show presents Jimmy being so impressionable, it makes us ask who he is deep down. We know he has some integrity. As Chuck famously said,
"He has a way of doing the worst things for reasons that sound almost noble."
I love Jimmy's expression here because it seems to be like, wait a second, does my brother actually kind of get me? Jimmy's integrity and his selfishness are very intertwined, almost as intertwined as nurture and nature, we might say. When he sabotaged Chuck's Mesa Verde filing, it was to benefit himself, but it was also very much to try to benefit Kim, as we talked about in part 2. This doesn't justify it, obviously, it's just part of the tragedy of Jimmy. And in that saga, actually, was a sort of follow-up on the wolves versus sheep thing. As we looked at, Kim reminds him to cover up loose ends, and he goes to the copy store to pay the employee to lie to Chuck and say he'd never seen Jimmy. To me, with the guy being much younger than him, it reminded me of the scammer coming into his parents' store and talking to little Jimmy. And if you watch this scene with a close eye, you can actually see there's an exact analogy for the wolves versus sheep, corrupting the youth moment. After Jimmy gives him a bunch of money, he asks about getting the security camera footage erased. The guy says it'll be expensive and talks Jimmy up from $100 to $200. In response to this, Jimmy says,
"You will go far, my young friend."
He's praising the younger guy's ability to optimize for personal profit and reinforcing the view of the world that justifies his own behavior. For one last example of Jimmy projecting his perspective, we can remember the bizarre, impassioned, unwanted speech he gave in the season 4 finale to the girl who didn't get the grant from the board Jimmy was put on. The board looked down on her for having gotten caught shoplifting in the past, and we can understand why Jimmy was defending her as he defended her. But he then goes way too far, and he reveals to her that the board was judging her and tries to indoctrinate her into his mentality.
I mean, they'll smile at you, they'll pat you on the head, but they are never, ever letting you in.
It doesn't land because she doesn't have the disposition to buy into the wolves versus sheep ideology. For whatever reason, she's not nurtured by the perspective Jimmy demonstrates so fanatically.
And the higher you rise, the more they're gonna hate you. Good. You rub their noses in it. You make them suffer. You don't matter all that much to them. So what?
And it's scenes like this that show us how much of an outcast Jimmy has felt like his whole life and how isolated his perspective makes him. I think we can assume Jimmy would still be saying this type of thing whether or not he had that childhood experience with the guy scamming his dad. However, is it fair to wonder whether he would still be this way if his dad was less naive and maybe even listened to him? Or more specifically, if his dad had found some way to get through to Jimmy despite their differences in values? Sort of similar to how we talked about in part 2, how Mike should have found a way to get through to his son even if they had different values when his son was, posed with that really difficult situation at work about should he be corrupt or not. And this is just the flip side of that, because here it's the kid who's more got the tendency to be corrupt rather than Mike being the parent having more tendency to be corrupt. As we talked about in part 1 with Kim and the flashback with her mom, when someone doesn't respect their given authority figures, they seek validation elsewhere. Our relationships with biological parents are especially interesting because in most cases these involve a whole lot of nature as well as a whole lot of nurture. What parents and guardians do as well as what they don't do obviously impacts us in immeasurable ways. In season 6, we saw another flashback to Kim and her mom at the start of episode 6, and actually it was the only episode of season 6 so far to start with a flashback like many of the old ones did. Just like everything in this show, it's very meaningful, and we see Kim's mom come to a store where Kim's been caught shoplifting. Interesting, shoplifting again. Her mom makes a big show of being unreasonably harsh, but then right as they leave, her demeanor changes and she expresses respect for Kim.
I didn't know you had it in you.
This gives across a very wolves versus sheep vibe, as she's saying, I didn't realize it was in your nature to take what you want despite the consequences. And granted, we haven't seen all that much of Kim's mom, but it's certainly important that this is the only time we've seen her be nice to Kim. Kim is learning that she gets love and respect when she breaks the rules, and even more than that, her mom stole the earrings actually, and says,
See? Your mom's good for something,
So her mom's even projecting her own feelings that she earns her own self-worth through her unethical behavior, demonstrating that such an approach to self-esteem is normal to her, while Lil' Kim internalizes a complicated message that the world of adults might not be how she had thought. We can also notice in the scene that she holds her mom's hand as they leave the store, even though her mom seemed harsh and authoritarian, because she, felt bad. She's a kid who wants to be loved and feel loved. But as soon as her mom makes fun of this situation, Kim is freaked out and lets go of her hand. Maybe something about her mom's immature and sort of antisocial perspective makes Kim feel that she's not a reliable source of love and support. What is Kim's nature? I mean, she's very young when she's doing this, of course. And similarly, someone could argue, well, look, Jimmy's a kid and he's already stealing from his parents. Doesn't that show selfishness is in his nature? But we have to acknowledge that by the time a kid is 5 years old, let alone 10 or 12, a whole lot of nurture has already happened. In that aside with his dad where he told him about the scammer, he used the word grifter, and his dad said, how do you know that word? So Jimmy was already well aware of the world of manipulative scammers. In school, in magazines, in TV shows or movies, somewhere Jimmy had learned enough to know money-oriented manipulation when he saw it. This was very likely not the first or last time he saw someone scam his dad. It bothered him deeply that his dad was gullible and that he always thought of other people before himself. For instance, we hear adult Jimmy tell his childhood best friend Marco in a season 3 cold open about how a customer once accidentally gave his dad a valuable rare coin.
I tell my dad, Pop, this quarter is rare. It's worth $4. Barely get the words out of my mouth, he hightails it out of here to give it back.
So $4 then is about $30 now, just to be clear. But the point is, Jimmy is upset just thinking about it.
He can't find the guy, so he tapes it to the side of the register. He's hoping that this guy will come back so he can return it.
Jimmy's tone of voice here is exasperated and incredulous. It's self-evident to him that his dad's ethical system was, in the words of the philosopher Nietzsche, meant to tranquilize him. Wow, this translation, I often like the British spellings of words, but not this one. Anyway, Jimmy tells Marco that he made the valuable coin disappear and adds,
And after that, every day after school, I'm checking the till. Something catches my eye, I stick it in the box, put it up there for good luck. So much for good luck.
As we saw in part 3, sometimes self-pity is the closest Jimmy can get to self-reflection. We looked at a line from this scene briefly in part 2 when we talked about how Jimmy considers unethical behavior necessary to his conceptions of success, and how the show makes us struggle with whether he's right. But I want to dig into this scene more because there's an interesting detail to it. After Jimmy's admission of stealing from his dad and his self-pitying comment about not having good luck, Marco responds like a good friend, simply saying it's a shame that his parents lost the store. Jimmy responds that they never should have had the store because they didn't have what it took to run it.
Yeah, they worked hard. They worked a lot of hours for a lot of years for nothing.
Marco disagrees and points out the great relationship Jimmy's parents had with the community, but Jimmy attributes this to his dad being a pushover.
Every deadbeat in the neighborhood owed him money. You come in here with a sob story, you leave with a pat on the back and a gallon of milk.
The thing is, I'm just speculating here, but I'm pretty sure even if Jimmy's dad could have known that the store would go out of business, he would have still given charity to people like he did, because from everything we learned, that was a fundamental part of how he existed in the world. The business didn't turn a profit, of course, but he got to live in line with his principles. To Jimmy, it was all a waste, and it wasn't worth doing if his dad wasn't going to do what it took to turn a profit. When we're wondering what might have nurtured this perspective in Jimmy, we don't need to look much farther than the increasingly profit-oriented societies we live in. Jimmy has certainly gotten the message, as we see when he's surprised other people haven't.
Can we make this easier? Just split it 4 ways?
I'll split you 4 ways. Don't they teach you capitalism in that school of yours?
Saying.
When Jimmy laments to Marco that his parents worked a lot of hours for a lot of years and didn't profit, he's lamenting that they accepted a life of essentially wage labor. They were running a business, of course, but never capitalized on it. When we see Jimmy trying to scam the Kettlemans in season 1 or season 6 for that matter, he's trying to force himself out of the feeling of dependency that comes with a wage. When he upsells the cell phones on the street, when he defends Lalo, he's not just trying to feel cool, he's trying to get the quantity of money that will make him feel independent in this world where if you aren't increasingly growing, then you're increasingly shrinking. Even Jimmy's job at Davis & Maine, with its high salary and amazing perks of his dream Cocobolo desk and a nice car, even this doesn't satisfy him. It's not independent enough. When he said he was stealing coins from his family business for good luck, maybe what he meant is for a feeling of power. And any legitimate job where he has to bend to someone else's authority, whether it's a boss or another coworker or a judge, it just doesn't sit right with him. The way he grew up, he perceived his dad as an unrespectable extreme of altruism, and Jimmy developed a lack of respect for authority in general. And though a lot of authority is unjustified and not worthy of respect, Jimmy takes it to such an extreme that he has a hard time with any limitations at all.
I'm so far beyond you! I'm like a god in human clothing! Lightning bolts shoot from my fingertips!
This might be a glimpse into what Freudians would call Jimmy's id, and it's quite interesting. Not everybody needs that rush to feel the way he's saying he feels. I mean, he doesn't really feel that way, but he's trying to act out feeling that way because he's the type of person that needs this sort of perception of no limitations on his behavior. He just wants and craves that. And I think that comes from feeling like he can never succeed in standard, polite society, so he has to try to transcend it. I talked in part 1 about Chuck telling Kim the story of their father's business closing and how he realized that $14,000 was unaccounted for, and how his dad didn't believe him when he insisted that Jimmy stole it. Just like the dad didn't believe Jimmy when he said the scammer was scamming him. I said something in the video about how Chuck was trying to warp Kim's perspective of Jimmy by telling her about one of the worst things he'd ever done, and I've gotten a lot of comments almost every day from people saying that Chuck was wrong and their dad's business closed closed because of his poor management. And I find this really interesting. The show gives us every reason to know for sure that Jimmy stole money from the family business. We see him do it, we hear him admit it to Marco, we know it. A few commenters said he only took coins that were collectibles, but he did that because they had what the economists might call exchange value.
It's worth $4.
We also know that Jimmy's father gave away money, and we have every reason to believe that this was an ongoing pattern. But if we as the viewers choose to believe that the business closed primarily because of the parents' mismanagement, then we're only looking at half the evidence, and we're living in the same reality as Jimmy. The show wants us to be perplexed and to struggle with this. We're supposed to have as many different interpretations as we do about the trolley problem we talked about in part 2. And trust me, you all had a lot of different interpretations about the trolley problem, but we don't want to get locked into one view because then we're too biased by the narrative of one of the characters, none of whom are completely correct. While it may be hard to believe that Jimmy could steal enough to actually affect the business, I'm not sure we can rule it out. There are no fully reliable narrators here. On a related note, at least 30 people have commented about how much they dislike or hate Chuck, and a fair number of people seem to agree with the sentiment Kim expressed to him once.
But you're the one who made him this way.
In this scene, she goes on to explain that Jimmy idolized Chuck and that Chuck didn't accept him. And we know that this is true to a large extent. Of course, we see Chuck be overly harsh with Jimmy a lot, not just at their mother's deathbed as we talked about in part 2, but also in the scene that's the last time they ever talk with each other before Chuck dies.
I don't want to hurt your feelings. But the truth is, you've never mattered all that much to me.
A few people have commented that they see Chuck as a villain, and I understand that, especially when we see how relaxed and natural he just seemed, saying the most hurtful thing possible to his brother. But I guess I see calling him a villain as defining him in literary terms, and if I imagine him as a flesh and blood human, it's harder for me to see him as a pure villain. In this light, in my opinion, he's as much of a villain as Jimmy is a hero.
I'm no hero.
But Chuck gets as little compassion from viewers as he does because he gives such a small quantity of compassion and understanding to Jimmy. The line we just saw of Chuck telling Jimmy he's never mattered to him came after Chuck rejecting Jimmy when he tried to apologize and express regrets for their conflict.
You're just going to keep hurting people?
That's not true.
Jimmy, this is what you do. You hurt people over and over and over, and then there's this show of remorse.
It's not a show.
Having someone who knows you since birth tell you that it's in your fundamental nature to hurt people so you should just embrace it is such a dark thing to think about. You can just call Chuck a bad person if you want, but since I don't really think like that, I find it more helpful to consider the fact that he was as much an emotional manipulator as Jimmy, as we talked about in part 1, and I think in this scene Chuck's making the classic manipulative mistake of hurting someone as a subconscious way of trying to make them change. I don't think he would ever in his right mind have actually wanted Jimmy to take this terrible advice to live without regrets. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I would like to hear, so let me know in the comments. However, as season 6 started with a flash forward where all his possessions are getting repossessed, it seems that Jimmy/Saul ends up actually taking this advice that Chuck gave him in this horrible moment of mean and unhelpful directness. Not that he stops apologizing for things, but he barely tries to rein in his desire to scam and manipulate. In season 6, we see him start the first episode with only one foot in the whole scamming Howard plan, but he very quickly gets on board with Kim about it. And it would be very silly to blame Kim for influencing him, since though she hatched the plan, she doesn't really twist his arm. He's just got such a flexible sense of his own values that he's able to be peer pressured by people silently. We mentioned this in the last video when we talked about his decision to defend Lalo, with this being right as Lalo basically plays hard to get and acts like, fine, you don't want to be a friend of the cartel, I don't care. And then with Kim, she's all fired up from a long and fulfilling day in this season 6 premiere, and when she mentions the plan to bring down Howard to get a huge case settled and paid out, they have this exchange.
We're doing that?
I thought we were, aren't we?
Kim communicates well here, puts it simply and clearly.
You think we shouldn't?
Well, I didn't say that.
Jimmy is a lot less clear because he's a lot less sure of himself. After a long silence and this expression, Jimmy's tune is starting to change.
The Howard thing. What were you thinking?
She asks if he's sure, and he gives one of my favorite lines.
What's the harm in listening?
I guess the harm in listening would be different for different people, but for Jimmy, this is the most we see him question the plan, and it seems like the brief feeling of Kim not thinking he's cool was already impossible for him to tolerate. But you can't have more than one first priority, and it's very hard for Jimmy to prioritize any principles that might have gotten in the way of the plan because he's not confident enough in himself to stand up against the wolves and sheep mentality he's gotten so ingrained. Because, see, despite his claims of lightning bolts shooting from his fingertips, Jimmy doesn't actually have high self-esteem, which we touched on in the previous video. And though Chuck's just one part of Jimmy's complicated life, he can be partially blamed to some extent for Jimmy's low self-esteem. Though we have to ask what really was his responsibility when Jimmy was the way he was. For instance, not showing up to Chuck's wedding, which we mentioned in part 2. They didn't talk for 5 years before Jimmy was arrested, which we talked about in part 1. Whose responsibility was it to bridge that gap and call when they hadn't spoken in years? You could say Chuck because he's the older brother, but I think they both had a responsibility to try harder. At the end of the day, none of us can be perfect to each other, but I think we owe it to each other to try our best and just try to help and not harm. And with his deep breath before telling Jimmy he's never cared about him, Chuck shows that a terrible amount of intentionality infuses his most harmful words. What made the moment even heavier was that Chuck was hanging out with all his appliances and lights turned on after working hard for a while to incrementally expose himself to electromagnetic waves to decrease the symptoms of his sensitivity/mental health issue. So this is the healthiest Jimmy has seen his brother in years, adding pain to the hurt of Chuck's harsh words. Even if someone wanted to argue that Chuck's assessment of Jimmy was correct, at best he's giving what's called destructive criticism. Unlike constructive criticism, destructive criticism tears down the person who's being criticized. Destructive criticism attributes fault to internal and fundamental aspects of the person instead of the ways they behaved, hurting them by considering their worst traits as their identity. Getting called out for the worst parts of yourself can have its merits for sure, but how it's done matters a lot. Like earlier, we looked at the line when Kim says to Chuck,
"But you're the one who made him this way."
And of course, there's truth to the claim that Chuck negatively influenced Jimmy, but as Kim is acting like Jimmy's defense attorney in this situation, she's only describing the facts from one side. It's a similar sort of destructive criticism in the sense that Kim is summing up Chuck with the behavior she's calling out, but more significantly, it's just completely unhelpful criticism because of how it's nestled within Kim and Jimmy both consciously gaslighting Chuck when he calls out Jimmy's sabotage. Chuck knows they're lying, so he's obviously not going to accept any harsh truth Kim might weaponize as a means to the lie's end. One interesting thing I haven't gotten the chance to mention yet in these videos is how this series has the parallel between Jimmy's difficulty changing his scammy behavior and Chuck's difficulty changing his ability to function with the symptoms of his electromagnetic sensitivity/mental health issue. In fact, in that scene we were looking at that was their last together, where Chuck was the healthiest Jimmy had seen him in years, Chuck says this at the start of it.
I always told you I'd get better. You just never believed me.
That line could have easily come out of Jimmy's mouth if he were talking about his ability to be a respectable lawyer, and it's a cool parallel that they both have these struggles to change, struggles of determination against their bad habits, or their natures? What their struggles to change have in common is they're both driven by a difficulty tolerating stress and discomfort. For Jimmy, it's the creeping dread he gets from feeling like he's playing by other people's rules and being a dependent sheep instead of an independent wolf. For Chuck, it's the loneliness and isolation after his separation from his wife. Jimmy's a bit too irresponsible to maintain meaningful social connections, and Chuck is too uptight, so they both block out the stress in analogous ways. Jimmy by giving in to his selfish impulses, and Chuck by giving in to his electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Which, by the way, let's talk about this directly, finally. That's what Chuck says he has.
It's a condition. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity.
There is quite possibly no condition more interesting for Chuck to have. If I were to believe some Better Call Saul viewers, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS, is entirely made up. But it's not that simple, and I don't think we should be so black and white about the difference between a proposed diagnosis and a diagnosis. But let's check this out. How do we know if someone has EHS? Well, first you might say, for someone to have EHS, they would need to perceive certain types of radiation differently than other people. They would need to actually be more sensitive, not just in their reaction, but in what they're reacting to. It would need to be provable that they react more to electromagnetic radiation. Well, one research group studied just that, and let's see what they said. That's right, I'm bringing in sources here. Evidence could be found for the existence of a subgroup of people with significantly increased electrosensibility, hypersensibility, who as a group could be differentiated from the general population. The presented data show that the variation of the electrosensibility among the general population is significantly larger than has yet been estimated by non-ionizing radiation protection bodies, but much smaller than claimed by hypersensitivity self-aid groups. These quantitative results should contribute to a less emotional discussion of this problem. This study developed a way of testing whether people actually had heightened sensibility to radiation, irrespective of whether or not they had symptoms of EHS, with the logic that such a sensibility is a necessary aspect of EHS and that a case of EHS could be ruled out if someone was tested and shown to not have hypersensibility. Everyone with EHS thinks they have hypersensibility, but if it could be proved that they don't, then they might feel even more confident pursuing exposure therapy or other treatments for their symptoms that they do have, besides just, avoidance of what they assume is the cause of their symptoms. After Jimmy proves in the legendary chicanery episode that Chuck in fact does not have the hypersensibility he thought he had, we see Chuck in the next episode start to do exposure therapy himself out of desperation, and he then reaches out to his doctor. We then of course see Chuck work with his doctor and improve his situation through therapy and exposure, so the only question is, why did he wait so long? He got hospitalized briefly in the first season, but doesn't make much treatment progress. Back then, we saw him explain to the doctor very clearly that he has EHS, and he says what his symptoms are. The symptoms are really varied, and the show wants you to question whether he's really correct to blame all that on electromagnetic radiation.
Burning sensation in my skin, sharp cold pain in my bones, muscle fatigue, heart palpitations, blurred vision.
He adds tinnitus, vertigo, nausea, shortness of breath, and then, interestingly, only stops when Jimmy interrupts him.
General
It hurts.
Yes, it hurts.
Jimmy says that only after the camera settles on him for several moments and we see him becoming uncomfortable with the sheer variety of his brother's reported symptoms. When I rewatched this scene, I found that a really important moment. Jimmy is acting defensive and treating the doctor like she's being nosy while demonstrating that he would prefer to consider his brother's debilitating condition only in general terms. Kim says in this scene that Chuck left HHM 18 months prior, and we know that Jimmy has been taking care of his brother this whole time, so he obviously has an intimate understanding of Chuck's reported symptoms. He just doesn't feel like Chuck should have to explain them to the doctor, or he doesn't have the distress tolerance to hear Chuck explain his symptoms. I get that Chuck is only in the hospital in this scene because the cops knocked in his door without a warrant and tasered him, but still, Jimmy and Chuck must both realize that no matter what Chuck is dealing with, he needs help. Jimmy soon tells the doctor that Chuck's seen the best doctors from here to Denver, so he seems to have just decided that doctors can't help. And well, also Chuck's animosity towards his doctor here might be because she's considering involuntary commitment. That is, letting Jimmy as Chuck's closest kin decide that he could be held in a psychiatric facility at the hospital without his consent. But honestly, I don't really understand why this would be the recommended treatment. And it makes perfect sense when Chuck then points out the law about using the least drastic means of treatment possible. It's strange to me that the commitment would be considered, but I suppose this show takes place in 2002, and I'm not going to try to look up what New Mexico's psychiatric commitment laws were 20 years ago. Just kidding, of course I am. Haven't you seen videos on this channel before? Here's the exact law Chuck cited. It's still on the books, word for word.
Section 43, 111, Part E3. The proposed commitment is consistent with the treatment needs of the client and with the least drastic means principle.
But the law makes it clear the person must be a danger to themselves or others, which it's not clear yet that Chuck was at this point, though he would be a year later. In this first scene with the doctor, she turns on the electronics connected to Chuck's bed as he explains how he has adapted to his life with EHS. Both Kim and Jimmy see her do it, and Jimmy makes a twisted expression, trying to swallow the skepticism that the doctor is expressing with her action. He took that test to heart, though, of course, and would use it later with his chicanery. story. The doctor correctly explains in private to Jimmy that Chuck's EHS is a manifestation of something deeper, but she proceeds it in a way I take issue with.
This allergy to electricity isn't real. It's a manifestation of something deeper.
I'm not saying it's 100% real.
That's an incorrect and unprofessional way to communicate, to throw around the word real like that. But I'm not canceling the doctor, I'm saying that the show is accurately portraying a genuine problem with accessing healthcare. Doctors and therapists and all professionals have issues and bad habits, and one terrible habit is to draw a hard line between the mind and the body. There are cultural systemic influences on us to view things in this way sometimes. You might say it comes from how we're nurtured. I found an academic article about Better Call Saul, actually, that talks about how the shift in Chuck's reception among other characters in the series brings out essential facets of the US-American psychiatric view. The article oversimplifies a few points that I don't think are worth going into, but makes some interesting claims like that the reluctance of Chuck, Jimmy, and Howard to discuss mental illness as a possibility results from the cultural belief in harsh consequences for those labeled mentally ill. But how wrong was Chuck to be subconsciously afraid of harsh consequences after the police burst in his door and tasered him, and he was being threatened with involuntary commitment, which, if I understand the law, can be for up to 30 days in New Mexico with a hearing within the first week. Involuntary commitment is a very difficult issue that comes from the conflict we talked about in part 2 between the right to self-determination and the right to safety. It's hard to see exactly how a licensed mental health professional could evaluate Chuck in this state and consider him a risk to himself or others. It's sad for Chuck that it took so long for him to get the situation he ultimately got, where he worked with the doctor in an outpatient setting at his home and did exposure work in the world. Like, had he never tried grounding exercises before she showed him them in season 3? If he had seen all kinds of specialists like Jimmy said, that would be really strange. I guess I'd assume that those appointments mostly went like it did this first time with this doctor. As we talked about a while ago, a precondition to electromagnetic hypersensitivity is electromagnetic hypersensibility, the ability to perceive EM waves at wider thresholds than other people can. So any doctor who is evaluating for EHS needs to test the EM stimulation of the patient. Testing it without the patient knowing seems like a good way to do that. If he's only sensitive to electricity when he notices it, then his issue is with noticing, not with electricity. And if the issue is with noticing, you're looking at some sort of response to stress. He's an overly confident guy, you know? He's convinced himself that he's right about everything, so once he gets it in his head that he needs to avoid all EM waves, anyone who disagrees is opposing counsel. But if his problem is more related to stress, is it a mental problem or a physical problem? Is stress mental or physical? Both, right? What does it even mean to ask whether something is mental or physical? Does something have to originate completely in the mind for it to be mental, or does it just have to have some contribution from the mind to be mental? For example, is post-traumatic stress disorder a mental problem when the person has a lot of physical symptoms and the original cause was physical? Is obsessive compulsive disorder a mental problem when there are physical manifestations of its symptoms as well as physical causes for it in the brain studied more and more and understood on a neurobiological level? You know, I might be the first one to say this, but I think the line between mind and body is a little bit complicated. We're acculturated by the societies we grow up in and how we understand many of the fundamental aspects of ourselves and our experiences, as we talked about earlier. As I looked into other sources about issues of mind-body dualism in the US, I found this passionate academic article that argues that a dualistic view of the self is outdated. Get ready for a little bit of philosophy lingo, but anyway, they write, consciousness, phenomenal first-person experience, qualia, free will, and the idea of the soul have all been used to stake out an ontological domain that is seen as non-compatible with a unified physicalist view of the universe. The result is a separation of mind and body, which has an immediate impact on how we view psychiatric illness and on the way psychiatric residents perceive their identity as physicians. We have reviewed recent findings from neuroscience to deconstruct the notions of mind, body, and self, consciousness, and the soul. The explanatory gap separating the brain from first-person experience is rapidly closing. Current studies are showing that the brain is constantly modified on timescales from seconds to decades by epigenetic modification of genes and modification of brain circuitry and brain connectivity. The challenge is to demonstrate how the profound plasticity of the human brain allows for a unitary, non-dualistic formulation of psychiatry. And let's just say this doctor comes up short in the non-dualism department. But I can't be too critical because despite that dualistic faux pas, she gets a lot right in this private conversation with Jimmy. She's a bit confrontational, but I like it.
And every other damn thing he needs.
Is that helping or enabling?
I get why she feels such an approach is necessary given the significance of the responsibility Jimmy has as Chuck's caretaker. Also, she is actually correct in her concerns to a very specific degree. I'm not sure if you remember, but she says this.
Coleman lanterns indoors, a camp stove. He could burn his house down.
The question is, how much weight should a prediction like that carry? It's true that he's not doing okay, that he needs help. If Jimmy wasn't around and if Chuck's employer wasn't a company he founded, how would he be sustaining himself? He's living in a dangerous circumstance that has just become normalized. Is he technically a harm to himself yet? If not, when does he become one? Let me know in the comments your opinion of what the involuntary commitment laws should be. About the doctor, you may or may not think her prediction is prophetic, but the larger point is that Chuck's situation was unsustainable. He really only needed outpatient care ultimately, and she should have known that. Plus, she should have been more compassionate about the situation Jimmy was in, but all that would have made for less interesting TV. By instead showing us Jimmy struggling with this decision of whether or not to commit Chuck, Better Call Saul has the opportunity to show how Jimmy would react to this situation, which is to first ask Kim,
What would you do?
You could say this is in keeping with the kind of codependence that we talked about in part 3, but really there is nothing wrong with wanting a little good advice, which she gives, saying Chuck needs help. And still, Jimmy says in a tough guy way that he's bringing Chuck home, but then when Howard shows up and agrees with him, he pretends to change his mind.
Wave bye-bye to your cash cow, because it's leaving the pasture.
He thinks Howard is scared by the thought of Chuck being committed and how that would affect HHM. I'm not going to be the type of mental health YouTuber who speculates about diagnoses, but I will say that as a licensed professional, watching Jimmy in this scene definitely rings some alarm bells. He projects this complicated, cynical, and unrealistic motive onto his perceived enemy and acts out to try to manipulate him, manipulating Kim briefly also in the process. The lie that Jimmy is using here to manipulate is one that actually makes him look really bad, painting him as someone who would make a serious medical decision for his brother out of spite towards Howard. He doesn't care or even realize how bad the lie makes him look because he so deeply has convinced himself of the purpose of the lie. But even if Howard somehow was scared rather than confused at Jimmy's irrational reactivity, how long would he be scared for? 1 minute? Jimmy's lie about committing Chuck was obviously immediately going to be revealed when he didn't commit Chuck. My point is that even if you think Jimmy's hatred of Howard is justified, the way he acts out on his feelings is unhealthy, and it's bizarre how much he can believe his own projected story about someone. He turns a complicated issue of how do I get my brother help into do what Chuck wants or do what Howard wants, which is a completely false dichotomy, of course, because they want the same thing in this situation. While I don't know why the doctor didn't suggest outpatient treatment at this time, I also don't know what Jimmy was ever expecting to see improve about Chuck's situation by bringing him home. But instead of criticizing individual characters, I think it's best to see the show as representing a realistic situation where in a group of adults, no one has a strong ability to understand and communicate that a problematic condition can have mental health aspects without being the end of the world. Look, if you're one of the people who commented saying you hate Chuck, go ahead and hate Chuck. I never did, personally, and I think it's sad he was so alone and that he didn't have the ability to get far enough along with the help he needed. When he finally breaks through his defenses and meets with the doctor out of his house, it's the humble, vulnerable side of Chuck that, I kind of like. It's really cool to see him face his issue, but it probably would have been nice for him if he didn't have to get publicly shamed first by his brother demonstrating to his colleagues and even his ex-wife that Chuck didn't have the hypersensibility to electromagnetic waves like he thought. When the doctor did this as a clinical test, Jimmy at the time said,
That was a dirty trick.
That wasn't a trick, it was a demonstration.
It was a necessary test, but Jimmy managed to ultimately use it as a dirty trick. When the doctor tested Chuck's EM sensibility, she didn't do it for her own good like Jimmy does when he does it to discredit his brother to get Jimmy a lighter consequence for his actions. Does Jimmy feel like Chuck deserves to be publicly shamed for his condition, or does he just not take the time to question question whether this side effect is worth it. Howard raises a similar question in his legendary speech in the season 6 mid-season finale to Kim and Jimmy when he questions their motivations for hurting him.
What justification makes it okay? Howard's such an asshole, he deserves it?
Since Better Call Saul shows us reality in its harshest form, Howard doesn't get rewarded much for speaking truth, let's just say. So why do they do what they do, and why does Jimmy do what he does? Is it like that meme of how I wake up knowing my opponents are ontologically evil and there's no act against them which is wrong? Is that Jimmy's mindset, or does he just neglect to consider the ethics here? What's sad is that this disturbing experience actually did lead to Chuck seeking help, but just because negative reinforcement sometimes works doesn't mean it's the best path, since there are often much more peaceful means to achieve the same end. One other source we can look at will help us understand Chuck's issue. This is from the conclusion of a 2011 review of the academic studies on electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS. Recent evidence in the scientific literature suggests that various objective physiological alterations are apparent in some EHS persons claiming to suffer after exposure to certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. As a result, many scientists now recognize that hypersensitivity to electromagnetic radiation can be a debilitating medical condition that is affecting increasing numbers of people throughout the world. In the end, regardless of whether one chooses to believe that EHS is fact or fiction, every ethical health provider has an obligation to sincerely listen to their patients, including those with EHS, and to do everything possible to ameliorate their suffering. In Better Call Saul, it's clear that Chuck doesn't have a consistent heightened ability to sense EM waves, and this is obviously proven. However, I don't know that we can assume this means Chuck is entirely pretending or entirely fooling himself. Especially because, as the article we just referred to adds, some individuals with EHS experience symptoms when exposed to electromagnetic radiation in the extremely low frequency ranges. Others appear to be more sensitive to frequencies emitted in the radio frequency or microwave range. Furthermore, some people will complain of distinct symptoms in response to different frequencies, such as mood changes when exposed to one frequency range and musculoskeletal discomfort at a different frequency range. It's possible Chuck was hypersensitive to certain frequencies but had convinced himself that he was hypersensitive to all of them. The concept of EHS was established only about 10 years before Chuck developed it, and it wouldn't be recognized by the WHO until a few years after Chuck developed it, so the care he received was necessarily poorly informed. For example, one paper from the last year explains that contrary to what some people say about EHS, not all symptoms are subjective, most symptoms are neurologic and usually not psychiatric. The article goes on to explain that it was shown that EHS is associated with brain neurovascular dysfunction, even with potentially neuronal lesions primarily involving the temporal lobes, most particularly the limbic system as well as other parts of the brain. But we have to ask, since there were definitely many situations where Chuck was not as sensitive to EM waves as he thought, why did he think he was? There could be many reasons, honestly. If we're right to assume he was somewhat sensitive to certain frequencies, then we can look back to the recent article we just cited, which says that once symptoms have occurred, it may be difficult for the patients to distinguish real exposure from sham exposure. Chuck could have over time learned to associate the wide variety of symptoms he mentioned all back to EM waves. This is a common way anxiety works, playing off of our natural struggles with the fallacy of correlation versus causation, so we end up associating things with our anxiety and then having that anxiety triggered by those things even though they weren't originally associated and maybe weren't originally the cause of that anxiety. I was debating with a family member who also loves Better Call Saul, and he said he thought Chuck was exhibiting psychosis since he was deluding himself about symptoms he was experiencing. My family member said, "Hey, Chuck thought his skin was burning. How is that not psychosis?" The fact is, we don't really know how much he was deluding himself about the symptoms. Instead, what we know is he was very likely deluding himself about the cause and about the nature of his condition, meaning what it was actually causing the condition and why. We know that he doubted his own ability to deal with the symptoms so much that he couldn't make progress for a long time. When you look at it that way, it starts to look a lot less like a thought disorder like psychosis and a lot more like an anxiety disorder. One study I found looked at the psychological symptoms and quality of life of people with EHS, but they skirted the controversy by, instead of calling it EHS, using the very very elegant phrase, idiopathic environmental intolerance attributed to electromagnetic fields, or IEI EMFs. Idiopathic means a condition whose original cause is unknown, by the way. But I mentioned this study not just to share their cool terms with you, but to say that one major finding was that the results suggest that IEI EMF is associated with elevated levels of obsessive compulsive behavior, interpersonal hypersensitivity, hostility, phobic anxiety, and paranoid thoughts. Whereas this is not clearly the case regarding psychotism. Psychotism? I don't use that word a lot. I'm not sharing this to just brag that I was right. I'm not even sure 100% that I was right. And again, I'm not here to diagnose characters, but I think this is an interesting distinction worth mentioning. It helps us understand EHS to understand the constellation of probable co-occurring conditions, just like it helps you understand someone to meet their family and friends. People with EHS do often struggle with psychological issues, as a lot of people do, but I think it would be a mistake to view the causation as going strictly from psychological issues to EHS symptoms, or from EHS symptoms to psychological issues. It seems to be more complicated than that. Okay, well, I didn't mean to talk about that for so long, but I'm glad I did. I assume this is already obvious to most people, but demonstrating that EHS is a real condition doesn't justify Chuck's horrendous behavior towards Jimmy. What it does really to take electromagnetic hypersensitivity seriously is well, guess what? It sort of plays back into the nature versus nurture question. Yeah, of course we were going to come back to that. Electromagnetic waves are part of our environment. You might say they're part of our nurture. And not just natural EM waves, of course, but artificial EM waves. And as one paper we looked at earlier actually explains, the fact that man-made artificial waves physically differ from those of natural origin is of critical importance, since the pulsed and polarized physical characteristics of artificial waves emitted by wireless technology may account for their toxico-biological effects. So look, I'm not out here trying to get rid of electricity. In fact, I use electricity every day. I just think if we're going to create a potentially harmful environment for ourselves and each other because it benefits us to have technology and so on, the least we can do is try to understand what's going on and what complicated sets of causes and effects might be interacting. And I think looking at this condition as much as we have today helps us understand the blurriness of the line between the mind and the body, and I think that's a really important understanding to have. By the way, I do think Jimmy tries to understand what's going on with Chuck. He doesn't just see Chuck's EHS as made up. In fact, at certain points he probably comes closer to understanding it than Chuck does. Several times in the series, Jimmy attributes Chuck's EHS symptoms to stress. When Jimmy takes Chuck home from the hospital after that scene we saw of him trying to manipulate Howard, he confronts Chuck by acknowledging that he knows Chuck saw the newspaper article calling Jimmy a hero for the fake situation he had orchestrated with the billboard. Jimmy suggests that Chuck seeing this is what caused his worsened symptoms.
Whenever you think I've done something wrong, something questionable, you get worse.
Chuck denies this, of course, and says he's too tired for the argument that they've had too many times. The problem is, while Jimmy does get Chuck to admit he thought the billboard thing was in poor taste, Jimmy is coming at this whole conversation in a defensive way. He's trying to defend his methods and rationalize his behavior rather than compassionately communicating to Chuck that stress might be a factor in Chuck's condition. And of course the show wants us to know that Jimmy has a point, since we see Chuck wince in this scene as if from symptoms with no EM waves in the vicinity. Jimmy promises to be better and Chuck says we'll see, and I just find it so fascinating how this show intertwines Jimmy's difficulty changing with Chuck's difficulty changing. If Chuck had been able to force himself to believe more that Jimmy could change, or even to just pretend that he believed it more, would Jimmy have changed more for the better? And if Jimmy had believed more that Chuck could get better from the EHS symptoms, would Chuck have gotten better more and sooner? In part 2, we talked about how our imperfect ability to predict the future affects ethical decision making, and here we've looked at how our limited conceptions of what is possible affects the way we support change and growth in our loved ones. I'm not saying we always need to believe that people can change no matter what, but that we should have informed and unbiased opinions as much as possible. We need to understand as best we can the complexities of our natures and our nurtures to really understand what people are capable of. Well, that was a really fun one, right? Wow, I think we all had a really good time, probably. In summary, the thing with nature and nurture is it seems like this big, deep question, oh, is it nature or is it nurture? But it's really just this false way of trying to boil down a multiplicity into a binary. and it's a false binary. Who even knows whether these two categories, nature and nurture, are even exhaustive, you know, of the influences in the world? Are they exhaustive? Is that all the influences in the world? Are these two categories even separate? I mean, we know that we have natural dispositions and that affects how we learn and grow, but how we learn and grow and what we learn and grow also affects our natural dispositions. So it's very complicated. They're intertwined. At the end of the day, we all have the moral responsibility to, as much as possible, nurture each other's natures. And I think that's maybe the takeaway, or one of them. Doesn't really matter. Thank you for watching this long. And thank you so much to the very kind, generous, and extremely cool people who support these videos on Patreon. Extremely cool. Like, I can't even believe how cool these people are. And now we've reached a new channel milestone because of all the great new people watching these videos now in the last few months. I can't even memorize the names of the supporters. It's gone beyond my admittedly very limited memory skills. But anyways, that's a huge milestone. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you so much to, I got my computer right here. This is cool. We're adapting to changing circumstances. Thank you so much to a very cool anonymous person, Elise. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Strawman Productions. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Magenta. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Thulusaurus Rex. Thank you, Gunther. Thank you, Adam. Big thank you to Adam. Thank you, Modest Maoist. I told you I have the coolest viewers. And thank you to Boom. I hope that's not your full legal name and I didn't dox you, I really hope. Thank you all so much. If you watching this were not on that list of very cool people and you would like to get on that cool list, plus also support these videos and show your support and, you know, maybe join a little online community on Patreon. Who knows? It's pretty small right now, but it could be cool eventually. There's a lot of extra stuff that I put on Patreon. Maybe a lot is putting it strongly, but I make videos, I make music, I make stuff. I have an album of music on there that's not gonna be put for free anywhere else. Especially the videos and music, those aren't even, you can't even see those anywhere else. So come check out the videos and music. I got some interesting investigations I'm looking into, some weird stuff I'm always into, and just come check it out. If you want to pay $1, $2, $3, whatever works for you, you can come support the channel on Patreon. Now, I must say, so this was part 4. You might, if you rewatch part 1, you might realize I wasn't always sure what my plan was, but I knew I wanted to do at least 4 parts. Well, there's gonna be a 5th part. And it might be the last part. I'll see. I've said a lot about this show. Some of the things I said in this video, I've literally been planning to say since January when I started having the idea to make videos about Better Call Saul. So some of this stuff I've literally been planning for months to say. It feels very good to finally say it and also say it in a way where I worked out what I really wanted to say and figured it out as best as possible. But I definitely will have more. Season 6 is unbelievably good. I love it. If you want to hear me say more about it, come follow the Twitch. I stream on Twitch like 2 or 3 days a week, sometimes more. Twitch.tv/whatstherapy, link in the description. I hang out, I play chess mostly, and I talk. You don't have to like chess. You don't have to like talking. You don't have to like me. You have to slightly like me. But it's a lot of fun. So come if you like Twitch, come hang out. You don't have to, you know, comment. If you don't like talking to people, you can just, you know, watch me play really amateur chess. But point is, I talk more about Better Call Saul there. I do sometimes like pre-Better Call Saul episode streams. I might do post-Better Call Saul episode streams, but it's a little late sometimes. So when it comes back on in July, if you want to come to hang out at the Twitch, like right before the new episodes, we're going to talk about it. I think that's a fun little thing. But anyways, love season 6. Definitely I'm gonna have a lot more to say, but I might try to just do one last video about this. Believe it or not, if you're new to the channel, I am also interested in other things besides Better Call Saul. So I love this show, and making these videos has been really amazing for me personally. I've loved it, and for the channel. I mean, come on, this has been huge. Look at the number of views we're getting. Look at all the new subscribers. It's really, really amazing. I've made creative work for many years, And I've honestly never, ever had this type of visibility on my writing or my creative work in any way. So it's really, really cool and fulfilling. And yet, I may try to make one final part 5. I like the number 5. Okay, there are 6 seasons of Better Call Saul though, so the number 6 would be good. So I might make 2 more parts now that I think about it. Maybe should have thought about it before I started filming. Doesn't matter. Point is, hang out, subscribe. If you're watching this long and you didn't subscribe, you gotta work on your YouTube skills because that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, gonna have more Better Call Saul stuff and really appreciate all the support and all the people coming to check out these videos. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. I love all your comments. I don't respond to all of them. That's not my vibe, but I read all of them. And they're really fun. I like them a lot. So thank you so much for participating in my little fun thing of overthinking Better Call Saul, the best show on television. All right, well, I guess that's it, and I'll probably let this video end now. Wait, no. Okay, right now.